Margaret Thompson sat quietly in the corner of the family gathering, watching her husband David laugh with his brothers while their children ran around the backyard. At 52, she had grown accustomed to the whispered conversations that stopped. When she entered a room, the pitying glances from relatives, and the well-meaning but painful questions about when she and David would finally have children of their own. For 27 years of marriage, Margaret had carried the weight of being labeled as the woman who couldn't give the Thompson family an heir. David's mother, Eleanor, had made it clear from the beginning that Margaret's inability to conceive was a source of great disappointment. The family's expectations hung heavy in the air during every holiday, every birthday party, every family milestone where Margaret remained the only wife without children. David had been nothing but supportive, at least outwardly. He would squeeze her hand when conversations turned to baby showers and school plays, telling everyone that they were perfectly happy, just the two of them. But Margaret could see the longing in his eyes when he held his nephews and nieces, the way his face would light up around children before returning to its polite mask when he caught her watching. The truth that Margaret carried inside her chest like a burning coal was far more complicated than anyone knew. She wasn't infertile. She had never been unable to conceive. In fact, the medical records locked away in her private safety deposit box told a very different story, one that would destroy not just her marriage, but the very foundation of the Thompson family legacy. Margaret had discovered the devastating truth about David just 3 months after their wedding, during a routine medical examination that was supposed to be about starting their family. The young doctor had delivered the news with clinical detachment that made Margaret's world crumble in an instant. David was completely sterile, had been since birth due to a rare genetic condition. He would never be able to father children, not with her, not with anyone. But there was more to the medical report that made Margaret's hands shake as she read it. The same genetic condition that made David sterile was hereditary, passed down through the male line. It should have been impossible for David to exist if his father, Robert Thompson, had the same condition. The doctor's confused expression as he reviewed the family medical history only confirmed what Margaret was beginning to understand. David's father wasn't his biological father. Eleanor Thompson, the woman who had spent decades making Margaret feel inadequate for not producing grandchildren, had been hiding a secret of her own, a secret that ran so deep it had shaped the entire Thompson family identity for over 50 years. Margaret left the doctor's office that day with a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could tell David the truth about his sterility and watch his dreams of fatherhood crumble, potentially leading him to discover the even more devastating truth about his parentage. Or she could remain silent, allowing the family to believe that she was the problem, the defective wife who couldn't fulfill her duty. In the weeks that followed, Margaret found herself studying Eleanor Thompson with new eyes. The older woman's insistence on maintaining the family's reputation, her fierce protection of the Thompson name, and her tendency to shift blame onto others suddenly made perfect sense. Eleanor had built her entire life around covering up her own deception, and Margaret was the perfect scapegoat. The weight of keeping David's secret while enduring the family's judgment began to eat away at Margaret's spirit. She watched her husband undergo expensive fertility treatments that she knew were pointless, saw him blame himself for their inability to conceive, and felt her heart break a little more each day. But she also saw how devastated he would be to learn not only that he could never be a father, but that his entire identity as a Thompson was built on a lie. Margaret began to understand that Eleanor's hostility toward her wasn't just about grandchildren. The older woman saw Margaret as a threat, someone who might discover the truth that Eleanor had spent a lifetime hiding. Every doctor's appointment, every fertility specialist consultation, every medical test was a potential landmine that could expose the Thompson family's greatest secret. As years passed, Margaret found herself becoming complicit in Eleanor's deception, but for different reasons. While Eleanor protected her secret to maintain her social standing and keep her family intact, Margaret protected it to shield the man she loved from a truth that would destroy him. She became the villain in the family story so that David could remain the innocent victim of circumstance. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that she was being punished for Eleanor's sin, bearing the shame that rightfully belonged to her mother-in-law. But love, she discovered, sometimes meant accepting blame that wasn't yours to bear, carrying burdens that weren't yours to carry, and sacrificing your reputation to protect someone else's peace of mind. What Margaret didn't know was that secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when they're buried as deep as the ones the Thompson family had been hiding. The truth was patient, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And when it finally did, it would shake not just David and Margaret's marriage, but reveal a pattern of deception that had been carefully maintained for generations. The foundation of everything the Thompson family believed about themselves was about to crumble, and Margaret, the woman they had blamed for so many years, would be the one to watch it all fall apart. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening when David arrived home from his brother Michael's house with tears in his eyes. Michael's wife had just announced her third pregnancy, and the celebration had been bittersweet for David, who had excused himself to the bathroom to compose himself before congratulating the happy couple. Margaret found him sitting on their bed holding a pamphlet about adoption services. "Maybe it's time we seriously considered this," he said quietly, not looking up at her. "I know we've talked about it before, but I think we need to face reality. We've tried everything else." The pamphlet felt heavy in Margaret's hands as she sat beside him. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, but now that it was here, the words felt impossible to speak. How do you tell the man you've loved for nearly 3 decades that everything he believes about himself and his family is a carefully constructed lie? "David," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." He looked up at her then, and she saw hope in his eyes, the kind of hope that comes from believing your spouse might have a solution to the problem that's been haunting your marriage. Margaret's heart broke knowing she was about to replace that hope with something much worse. She told him everything. The medical report from 27 years ago, the doctor's confusion about the genetic impossibility, the inference about his father's true parentage, and her own decision to remain silent all these years. David listened without interrupting, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, anger, and finally, a devastating understanding. "You've known this whole time?" he asked, his voice hollow. "You've let me go through fertility treatments, let me blame myself, let my family blame you, and you've known this whole time that none of it mattered." Margaret tried to explain her reasoning, the impossible choice she had faced, her desire to protect him from a truth that would shatter his world. But David was no longer listening. He was staring at the wall, processing the implications of what she had revealed. "My father isn't my father," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "My mother had an affair, got pregnant, and has been lying about it for over 50 years, and you've been covering for her." The accusation stung because it was partially true, but Margaret had never seen it as protecting Eleanor. She had been protecting David, their marriage, and the illusion of the family he loved so much. But she could see now how her silence had made her complicit in Eleanor's deception. David left that night, saying he needed time to think. Margaret didn't sleep, instead pacing their empty house and wondering if she had just destroyed her marriage by finally telling the truth. The next morning, David returned, but he was different. The man who had left was heartbroken about their childlessness. The man who returned was consumed with questions about his identity and his mother's lies. Within a week, David had confronted Eleanor. Margaret wasn't present for that conversation, but she heard about it from David's sister-in-law, who called in a panic to say that Eleanor had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing during an argument with David. The stress of her secret, Being exposed after 5 decades had triggered a mild heart attack. At the hospital, Eleanor finally admitted the truth, but only partially. She confirmed that Robert Thompson was not David's biological father, but she refused to name the real father. Through tears and medication-induced confusion, she claimed it had been a one-night mistake with a stranger, someone whose name she couldn't even remember. Margaret knew Eleanor was still lying. A woman doesn't forget a man who fathers her child, especially when that child becomes the center of her world for 50 years. But Eleanor took the identity of David's real father to her grave, dying 3 months later from complications related to her heart condition. The revelation of Eleanor's secret sent shockwaves through the Thompson family. Robert Thompson, now 81 and suffering from dementia, couldn't understand why his sons were asking him strange questions about David's parentage. David's brothers, Michael and James, struggled to process that their younger brother wasn't their full sibling, while their wives whispered about the scandal that had been hiding in plain sight. But the most devastating impact was on David himself. The man who had built his identity around being a Thompson, who had taken pride in the family business and traditions, suddenly didn't know who he was. The genetic condition that made him sterile was the final proof of his illegitimate parentage, a medical confirmation of his mother's betrayal. Margaret watched her husband spiral into depression and anger, not just at his mother's deception, but at her own role in maintaining it. He moved into the guest room, barely speaking to her except when necessary. Their marriage, which had survived 27 years of infertility struggles, was crumbling under the weight of truth. The family business, Thompson Construction, became another casualty. David had been groomed to take over from his father, but now he questioned his right to inherit what he saw as his brother's birthright. Michael and James assured him that business ownership wasn't about blood, but about the work he had put in. But David couldn't see past his own sense of illegitimacy. Margaret realized that in trying to protect David from pain, she had actually prolonged and intensified his suffering. The truth she had hidden for nearly 3 decades had emerged at the worst possible time, when he was already vulnerable and when his mother was too ill to provide the full explanation he needed. Her secret-keeping had denied him the chance to process his identity gradually and with support. The Thompson family gatherings stopped entirely. The brothers could barely look at each other without being reminded of the lies that had shaped their family dynamic. The grandchildren asked why Uncle David and Aunt Margaret didn't come to birthday parties anymore, but their parents struggled to explain without revealing the adult complexities that had torn the family apart. As winter approached, Margaret found herself more isolated than ever. The family that had once merely tolerated her now actively blamed her for keeping a secret that might have been handled differently if revealed earlier. David remained in their house but felt like a stranger, and Margaret began to understand that some truths, no matter how well-intentioned their concealment, can destroy more than the original lie ever could. 6 months after Eleanor's death, an unexpected visitor appeared at Margaret and David's door. Thomas Morrison was a private investigator hired by David's brother Michael, who had grown frustrated with the unanswered questions surrounding their mother's secret. Michael believed the family deserved to know the complete truth, especially since David's depression was deepening and their father Robert's dementia was worsening. Thomas had spent weeks tracking down leads from Eleanor's past, interviewing elderly residents of their neighborhood and combing through old employment records. What he discovered was far more complex than anyone had imagined. Eleanor Thompson hadn't had a random affair with a stranger. She had been involved in a long-term relationship with a married man, someone the family knew well. The man was Dr. William Hayes, the family physician who had delivered David and treated the Thompson family for over 30 years. Dr. Hayes had died 15 years earlier, taking his secret to the grave, just as Eleanor had attempted to do. But Thomas had found letters hidden in Eleanor's attic, passionate correspondence between Eleanor and Dr. Hayes that spanned several years in the early 1970s. Margaret watched David read the letters with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Here was evidence of a deep, emotional connection between his mother and the man who had been present for every childhood illness, every family medical emergency, every intimate health concern. The doctor who had comforted David through broken bones and childhood fears was actually his biological father. The revelation was devastating on multiple levels. Dr. Hayes had been married with 3 children of his own, all of whom were still alive and living in nearby communities. David suddenly had half-siblings he had never known about, people who had grown up thinking of Dr. Hayes as a devoted family man rather than someone who had fathered a secret child. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Dr. Hayes had known about David's parentage and had never said anything. For 30 years, he had treated David as a patient while knowing he was treating his own son. He had even been present during Margaret and David's fertility consultations, fully aware that David was sterile, but never revealing why. Margaret began to understand the full scope of the deception that had shaped their lives. It wasn't just Eleanor who had been lying. Dr. Hayes had also been complicit, watching David struggle with infertility while possessing the medical knowledge that could have explained everything. The conspiracy of silence had involved multiple people, all protecting their own interests while David and Margaret suffered. The discovery of Dr. Hayes's identity opened new wounds but also provided some answers. David learned that his love of science and his analytical mind came from his biological father, traits that had never been present in the Thompson family line. The genetic condition that made him sterile was inherited from Dr. Hayes, who had also been unable to father children with his wife after David's birth. This revelation led to another shocking discovery. Dr. Hayes's 3 legitimate children were all adopted, a fact the family had hidden for decades. David's existence was proof that Dr. Hayes could father children, which meant his wife's inability to conceive more children after David's birth was likely due to medical complications from the stress of discovering her husband's affair. Margaret watched as David began reaching out to his half-siblings, tentatively at first, then with growing desperation. He needed to understand who he was, to find some sense of belonging after learning that his entire identity had been built on deception. The Hayes children were initially suspicious and then angry when they learned about their father's affair and secret child. The oldest Hayes son, Robert, was particularly hostile. He felt that David's existence tainted his father's memory and refused to acknowledge any family connection. The middle child, Sarah, was more sympathetic, but struggled with the implications for her own family's story. The youngest, Peter, was curious about David, but worried about how the revelation would affect his elderly mother, Dr. Hayes's widow. Margaret realized that David's quest for identity was creating ripple effects in another family, disrupting their carefully maintained narrative just as it had destroyed the Thompson family's foundation. The secrets that Eleanor and Dr. Hayes had kept weren't just personal choices. They were time bombs that continued to explode decades later, hurting innocent people who had never asked to be part of the deception. As David became more obsessed with connecting to the Hayes family, his relationship with Margaret continued to deteriorate. He blamed her not just for keeping the secret, but for denying him the chance to know his real father before Dr. Hayes died. Margaret had robbed him of 15 years when he could have had a relationship with his biological father, could have understood his medical condition, could have found his place in the world. The Thompson family business finally collapsed under the strain. Michael and James had been trying to keep it running while David worked through his identity crisis. But without his input and leadership, they couldn't maintain the contracts and relationships their father had built over decades. The family legacy that Robert Thompson had worked a lifetime to create crumbled in less than a year. Margaret found herself watching the destruction of not one but 2 families, both torn apart by secrets that had seemed like acts of protection at the time. Eleanor had hidden her affair to preserve her marriage and social standing. Dr. Hayes had remained silent to protect his medical practice and his legitimate family. Margaret had kept the secret to shield David from pain, but in the end, all of their protective lies had created more damage than the original truth might have caused. The secret had grown and festered, involving more people and creating deeper deceptions with each passing year. What might have been a difficult conversation about infertility and parentage in 1997 had become a multi-generational catastrophe by 2024. David's depression deepened as he realized that the people he had trusted most in the world had been lying to him his entire life. His mother, his family doctor, and his wife had all conspired in their different ways to keep him from understanding who he truly was. The man who had once been confident and successful now questioned every relationship, every assumption, every foundation of his existence. Margaret began to understand that some secrets are too big to keep, that the weight of protecting someone from truth can ultimately destroy the very thing you're trying to preserve. Her marriage, David's relationship with his family, and his sense of self had all been casualties of her well-intentioned deception. 1 year after the truth came out, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She filed for divorce, not because she had stopped loving David, but because she realized that their marriage had become toxic for both of them. David couldn't look at her without being reminded of the decades of deception, and Margaret couldn't bear to watch the man she loved destroy himself with anger and obsession. The divorce proceedings revealed just how deeply the secret had poisoned their relationship. David's lawyer argued that Margaret had committed fraud by concealing material information that affected their marriage decisions. Margaret's lawyer countered that she had been protecting her husband from devastating news, acting out of love, rather than malice. The legal battle became a public dissection of their private pain. During the divorce mediation, more family secrets emerged. Robert Thompson's dementia had progressed to the point where he could no longer maintain the careful boundaries between truth and fiction that had protected the family for decades. In confused moments, he would talk about Eleanor's gentleman, friend, and make references to David being different from the other boys in ways that suggested he had known about the affair all along. Margaret realized that Robert Thompson had spent 50 years knowing that David wasn't his biological son, but had chosen to raise him anyway. The man she had seen as a victim of Eleanor's deception had actually been complicit in it, making a conscious choice to accept David as his son regardless of genetics. This revelation cast Robert in a different light, showing him as perhaps the most noble figure in the entire story. But Robert's moments of clarity also revealed darker truths. He spoke about the pressure Eleanor had put on him to maintain the secret, the threats she had made about leaving him if he ever revealed what he knew. Eleanor hadn't just been protecting herself, she had been controlling her entire family through manipulation and emotional blackmail. The divorce was finalized just as another bombshell hit the fractured families. Peter Hayes, Dr. Hayes's youngest son, had been conducting his own investigation into his father's affair with Eleanor. What he discovered changed everything they thought they knew about the relationship. Peter found his father's private journals hidden in the basement of the family home that his mother had recently sold. The journals revealed that the affair between Dr. Hayes and Eleanor hadn't been a brief romantic entanglement. It had been a calculated arrangement that served both their purposes. Eleanor had wanted a child, but couldn't conceive with Robert due to his undisclosed fertility issues. Dr. Hayes had wanted to prove his virility after his wife's miscarriages had led to whispers about his own fertility. The affair had been planned, purposeful, and limited to the time it took for Eleanor to become pregnant with David. Both parties had entered into it with clear expectations and had ended it as soon as those expectations were met. David hadn't been the product of passion or love, but of a cold biological transaction between two people who needed something from each other. Margaret was horrified by this revelation, but she also felt a strange sense of vindication. The secret she had kept wasn't about protecting a great love story or a moment of human weakness. She had been protecting David from learning that his conception had been a business arrangement, that he had been created to serve his parents' psychological and social needs rather than out of genuine desire for a child. David's reaction to his father's journals was even more devastating than his initial response to learning about his parentage. The discovery that his existence had been planned as a solution to other people's problems rather than as a wanted child sent him into a spiral that worried everyone who knew him. He began drinking heavily and isolating himself from all family members, including his half-siblings who had finally begun accepting him. Margaret found herself in the strange position of being divorced from David but still caring deeply about his well-being. She was the only person who understood the full scope of what he was processing, the only one who had lived with the weight of the secret for decades. Despite their legal separation, she felt responsible for the man whose world she had helped destroy by finally telling the truth. The Thompson family business was sold to competitors, ending 3 generations of family ownership. Michael and James used their portions of the sale to relocate their families to different states, seeking fresh starts away from the scandal that had consumed their hometown. The Thompson name, once respected in the community, became associated with dysfunction and deception. Robert Thompson died in his sleep 6 months after the divorce was finalized, never having fully understood what had happened to tear his family apart. His funeral was small and awkward, with family members who barely spoke to each other standing around his grave. David attended but stood apart from his brothers, no longer sure if he belonged at a Thompson family gathering. Margaret attended the funeral despite her divorce from David, feeling that Robert had been the one family member who had shown her consistent kindness over the years. She realized now that his acceptance of her might have been rooted in guilt over his own role in the family's deceptions. But his kindness had been genuine nonetheless. After the funeral, Margaret and David had their first real conversation since the divorce proceedings began. Standing in the cemetery where Robert was buried next to Eleanor, David finally asked the question that had been haunting him for over a year. "Do you think things would have been better if you had told me the truth from the beginning?" he asked, his voice hollow but no longer angry. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "I think different doesn't necessarily mean better," she said. "If I had told you 27 years ago, you would have had to carry that burden your entire adult life. You would have questioned every interaction with your parents, every family gathering, every moment of happiness. Maybe you would have been able to handle it better when you were younger, or maybe it would have destroyed you then instead of now." David nodded slowly, and Margaret could see that he was finally beginning to understand the impossible position she had been placed in. There had been no good choices, only different kinds of damage. Her silence had protected him for decades, but had also denied him agency over his own life. Her honesty had freed him from deception, but had also destroyed his sense of self. As they walked away from the cemetery together, Margaret realized that their story wasn't really about infertility or family secrets. It was about the price of love, the weight of protection, and the devastating consequences that can result from trying to shield someone from painful truths. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is also the most destructive. 2 years after Robert Thompson's funeral, Margaret received a phone call that would reveal the final layer of deception in the family's tangled web. The caller was Dr. Elizabeth Hayes Morgan, Dr. William Hayes's daughter from his first marriage, a marriage that had ended in divorce long before he met his second wife and had the 3 children David had been trying to connect with. Elizabeth explained that she had been following the news of her father's posthumous scandal with growing unease. She had remained silent during David's attempts to connect with his half-siblings because she had her own devastating secret about their father. Dr. Hayes hadn't just had an affair with Eleanor Thompson. He had been conducting similar arrangements with multiple women over the course of several decades. Margaret listened in stunned silence as Elizabeth revealed that Dr. Hayes had fathered at least 7 children with different women, all while maintaining his respectable facade as a family physician. The arrangements were always the same. Women who wanted children but couldn't conceive with their husbands would approach Dr. Hayes, who would provide his services in exchange for absolute secrecy and ongoing access to the children as their family. Doctor. David wasn't unique. He wasn't even the first or the last. He was simply one of several children born from his biological father's systematic exploitation of desperate women and their infertile husbands. The revelation shattered David's remaining illusions about his origins and left him questioning whether anything about his existence had been genuine. Elizabeth had kept this secret for over 20 years, ever since she had discovered her father's activities while helping him organize his medical files before his retirement. She had been horrified by the scope of his deception, but had chosen to remain silent to protect the families involved. Now, seeing the destruction that partial truth had caused in David's life, she wondered if complete honesty might be more merciful than continued deception. The existence of David's other half-siblings created a new crisis. Some were living in the same community, their families completely unaware of their true parentage. Others had grown up in different states, their mothers having moved away to hide their arrangements with Dr. Hayes. Elizabeth had been tracking them for years, watching from a distance as they lived their lives unknowing. Margaret found herself in the surreal position of helping David process the fact that he had 6 half-siblings he had never known about, in addition to the 3 Hayes, children he had been trying to connect with. The scope of Dr. Hayes's deception made Eleanor's affair seem almost innocent by comparison. Eleanor had been trying to solve a specific problem with her marriage. Dr. Hayes had been running what amounted to a secret fertility clinic for decades. The revelation also cast new light on Margaret's own experience with Dr. Hayes. She remembered the fertility consultations from the early years of her marriage, when Dr. Hayes had examined both her and David, while knowing full well that David was sterile and that he was David's biological father. The doctor had put them through expensive and pointless treatments, while possessing the medical knowledge that could have saved them years of anguish. David began reaching out to his newly discovered half-siblings, but the responses were mixed. Some were curious and wanted to connect, while others were horrified by the revelation and wanted nothing to do with him. Several families were torn apart by the discovery that their patriarch wasn't the biological father of their children, creating the same kind of devastation that had consumed the Thompson family. One of David's half-sisters, Maria Santos, had been living just 20 miles away for her entire life. Her mother had died without ever revealing the truth about Maria's parentage, leaving Maria to discover through DNA testing that her beloved father wasn't her biological parent. The revelation had destroyed Maria's marriage and estranged her from her siblings, who couldn't accept that their family had been built on deception. Margaret watched David bond with Maria over their shared experience of late-in-life identity disruption. Both had learned devastating truths about their origins that had destroyed their existing family relationships. Both had been raised by loving fathers who weren't genetically related to them. Both had mothers who had taken massive secrets to their graves. The connection between David and Maria was healing for both of them, but it also highlighted how Margaret's role in the deception had isolated her from any similar support system. David could connect with other victims of Dr. Hayes's arrangements, but Margaret remained alone in her experience of carrying the secret for nearly 3 decades. As more of Dr. Hayes's children discovered the truth about their parentage, a clear pattern emerged. The doctor had targeted women from stable, affluent families where the husband's infertility would be seen as shameful. He had exploited their desperation and their social positions, knowing that they would be motivated to keep his secret to protect their marriages and reputations. The scope of Dr. Hayes's deception began attracting attention from local media and medical ethics boards. Even though the doctor had been dead for years, investigations were launched into his practices and the families he had deceived. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked medical authority and the long-term consequences of secrets. Margaret found herself testifying before a medical ethics review board about her experience as the spouse of one of Dr. Hayes's secret children. She spoke about the psychological impact of carrying a secret that affected multiple generations, the impossible choices faced by family members who discovered devastating truths, and the ripple effects of deception that continued decades after the original lies were told. Through her testimony, Margaret began to understand that her story wasn't just about her marriage or even the Thompson family. It was part of a larger pattern of institutional deception that had affected dozens of families over several decades. Dr. Hayes had used his position of trust and medical authority to manipulate vulnerable people, creating a web of secrets that had damaged multiple generations. The investigation revealed that Dr. Hayes had kept detailed records of his arrangements, including photographs and medical information about all of his secret children. The discovery of these files created new, ethical dilemmas about privacy, consent, and the rights of the families involved. Some wanted access to their medical histories, while others wanted the records destroyed to protect their privacy. Margaret realized that the secret she had kept for 27 years was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of deception. Her silence had been part of a system that had allowed Dr. Hayes to continue his unethical practices for decades, but breaking her silence had also opened a door that could never be closed again. 5 years after the truth first emerged, Margaret stood in a community center addressing a support group for families affected by fertility fraud. The term had been coined to describe cases like Dr. Hayes's systematic deception, and Margaret had become an unlikely advocate for transparency in reproductive medicine and family counseling. David sat in the back of the room, no longer her husband, but now her closest ally in helping other families navigate the devastating discovery of hidden parentage. Their divorce had been necessary for their individual healing, but their shared experience had created a different kind of bond based on mutual understanding rather than romantic love. The support group included several of David's half-siblings and their families, as well as other families from around the country who had discovered similar deceptions. Margaret had learned that Dr. Hayes's practices, while extensive, were not unique. Medical professionals in multiple states had been engaging in similar unethical arrangements for decades, creating a generation of people who were discovering their true parentage through DNA testing and genealogy research. Maria Santos had become the organizer of the support group, using her experience as a social worker to help families process their discoveries. She and David had developed a close friendship that had helped both of them rebuild their sense of identity and purpose. Margaret was grateful that David had found someone who understood his experience in ways that she never could. The investigation into Dr. Hayes's practices had revealed the existence of detailed files on all of his arrangements, including copies of the letters he had exchanged with Eleanor Thompson. Reading those letters had been devastating for David, but they had also provided closure. He finally understood the full scope of what his parents had arranged and why they had chosen to keep it secret. Eleanor's letters revealed a woman who was desperate to have a child but also deeply calculating about protecting her reputation. She had researched Dr. Hayes's background, investigated his family situation, and planned the affair with the precision of a business transaction. Her love for David had been genuine, but his conception had been coldly strategic. Dr. Hayes's letters revealed a man who saw himself as providing a service to desperate families while satisfying his own ego and desires. He had convinced himself that his actions were noble, that he was helping couples achieve their dreams of parenthood while providing superior genetic material for their children. The delusion and arrogance in his correspondence was staggering. Margaret had initially resisted reading the correspondence between Eleanor and Dr. Hayes, feeling that it was too private and painful for David to process. But David had insisted that he needed to understand every aspect of his origins, no matter how disturbing. The letters had been the final piece of the puzzle, showing him exactly how his existence had been planned and why his parents had been so committed to keeping the secret. The support group had become a place where families could process not just the discovery of hidden parentage, but the complex emotions that came with learning that their existence was the result of deception. Children struggled with feeling unwanted when they learned they were the products of arrangements rather than love. Parents grappled with the realization that their fertility struggles had been exploited by trusted medical professionals. Margaret often spoke about the unique perspective of spouses who discovered devastating family secrets. She had experienced the isolation of carrying knowledge that affected everyone around her, the impossible choice between protecting loved ones from pain and denying them agency over their own lives. Her story resonated with other family members who had found themselves in similar positions. The legal ramifications of Dr. Hayes's actions were still unfolding years after his death. Several families had filed lawsuits against his estate and the medical practice that had employed him, seeking damages for emotional distress and medical fraud. The cases were complicated by the passage of time and the fact that many of the arrangements had been consensual, even if they were unethical. Margaret had been called as a witness in several of these cases, providing testimony about the long-term psychological impact of keeping family secrets. Her experience had become a case study in how deception could damage not just the people directly involved, but entire family systems across multiple generations. The Thompson family had never fully recovered from the revelations. Michael and James remained distant from David, unable to process their complex feelings about their brother's true parentage and their mother's deception. Their children, David's nephews and nieces, had been told sanitized versions of the family crisis that left them confused about why their uncle had disappeared from their lives. But David had found a new sense of purpose in helping other families navigate similar discoveries. He had returned to school to study genetic counseling, using his own experience to help people understand the medical and emotional implications of DNA testing and family secrets. His work gave him a sense of meaning that had been missing since his identity crisis began. Margaret had also found unexpected fulfillment in her advocacy work. The woman who had once been blamed for her family's childlessness had become a voice for transparency and ethical medical practice. She spoke at medical conferences about the importance of honest communication with patients and the dangers of allowing secrets to fester across generations. The support group had grown to include over 50 families affected by various forms of reproductive deception. Margaret had watched people process their discoveries in different ways, some finding peace through connection with newfound relatives, others choosing to maintain distance from the truth that had disrupted their lives. There was no right way to handle these revelations, only different paths through the grief and confusion. Dr. Hayes's widow had eventually joined the support group, seeking to understand the man she had been married to for 40 years. Her discovery that her husband had fathered multiple children outside their marriage while she struggled with infertility had been devastating, but she found some comfort in connecting with the families he had deceived. She apologized repeatedly to David and the others, as if she could somehow make amends for her deceased husband's actions. The most profound realization for Margaret had been understanding that secrets are rarely contained to the people who keep them. Eleanor's deception had affected not just her immediate family, but her grandchildren, her daughters-in-law, the Hayes family, and eventually dozens of other families connected to Dr. Hayes's practices. The ripple effects of a single lie had expanded far beyond anything Eleanor could have imagined when she first decided to hide David's true parentage. As Margaret prepared to leave the support group meeting that evening, she reflected on how different her life had become from what she had expected. She had thought her greatest challenge would be living without children, accepting the label of the infertile wife who had disappointed her husband's family. Instead, she had become an advocate, an expert in family trauma, and a voice for people whose lives had been shaped by secrets they didn't know they were carrying. David approached her as she was gathering her materials, and for a moment they stood together in comfortable silence. Their marriage hadn't survived the truth, but their connection had evolved into something deeper and more honest than what they had shared during their years of hidden knowledge. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had been able to have children?" David asked, a question he had never voiced during their marriage. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think we would have loved them completely," she said. "But we also would have passed on the secret, and they would have had to carry the burden of not knowing who they really were. Maybe it's better that we didn't bring children into this web of deception." David nodded, understanding that their childlessness had been both their greatest sorrow and their salvation. They had been spared the complexity of raising children while carrying such a massive secret, spared the dilemma of whether to tell their children the truth about their grandfather's identity. As they walked to their cars, Margaret realized that the story she had lived was ultimately about the price of protection and the courage required for truth. She had spent 27 years trying to shield David from pain, only to discover that her protection had caused different but equally devastating damage. The truth had destroyed their marriage and their family, but it had also freed them to build new lives based on honesty rather than deception. The Thompson family name might have been tarnished by scandal, but the people who had carried it had found ways to create meaning from their suffering. David's work helping other families, Margaret's advocacy for medical ethics, and even the support group's existence were all positive outcomes that had emerged from their painful journey through deception and discovery. Margaret drove home that night, understanding that some stories don't have happy endings, but they can have meaningful ones. The secret that had defined her marriage for nearly 3 decades had been revealed, processed, and transformed into something that could help others. The childless woman who had once been blamed for her family's problems had become a source of healing for families facing similar crises, proving that even the most devastating truths can eventually